November 1944. Slovakia's highest mountain, Mount Dumbier, became a frozen hell. Wind howled with such fury it knocked grown men off their feet. Ice formed on eyebrows and hair, turning them into crystallized bunches that crackled when touched. The cold was so brutal, it felt like knives slicing exposed skin. Through this blizzard, a young woman led a group of desperate men. She was 23 years old. Her name was Maria Gulovich, and she was an elementary school teacher who spoke 5 languages. Around her, 12 American intelligence officers and 18 downed airmen struggled forward through waist-deep snow. Their faces were gaunt from hunger. Their uniforms hung loose on bodies wasted by weeks of running. Behind them, elite German SS units prowled the mountains with dogs and guns. They couldn't stop moving, not even to catch their breath, because all around them, the mountain told a story of what happened to those who rested. Frozen bodies littered the slope. Partisan fighters who had stopped to sit, to take just a moment's break from the screaming wind and bone-deep cold. They never stood up again. Maria counted them as the group passed. 1 body, 10, 20, 50. The count kept rising. By the time they reached the lodge, they had passed 83 frozen corpses. Maria's feet were already badly frostbitten. Every step sent pain shooting up her legs. But she kept walking, kept talking in German to villagers they encountered, kept smiling at German soldiers at checkpoints, kept lying with such charm and confidence that no one suspected this peasant girl in simple clothes was guiding Allied intelligence agents through Nazi-occupied territory. This is the story of Maria Gulovich, one of the most remarkable women of World War II. A story that remained virtually unknown for decades. A story of courage that defied belief. Maria Gulovich was born on October 19, 1921, in the small village of Jakubany in northeastern Slovakia, though some records list her birthplace as nearby Litmanova. This was a world of wooden churches and mountain valleys where life moved slowly and traditions ran deep. Her father, Edmund Gulovich, served as a Greek Catholic village priest. Her mother, Anastasia, worked as an elementary school teacher in the local community. Growing up in this rural corner of Europe, Maria lived in a household where education mattered. Her mother's profession influenced her deeply. Books and learning were valued in their home, even though money was often tight. The Gulovich family spoke Slovak at home, but Maria grew up hearing multiple languages in their multilingual region near the Polish border. Slovakia itself was a complicated place in those years. After World War I, it had become part of Czechoslovakia, but ethnic tensions simmered beneath the surface. Many Slovaks felt dominated by the Czechs. When Hitler began carving up Central Europe in the late 1930s, Slovakia became caught in the chaos. Maria was a bright student with a particular gift for languages. She had those striking blue eyes that people remembered. She was vivacious, warm, and had a quick wit that would later save her life more than once. After finishing her basic schooling in Jakubany, she enrolled in a Greek Catholic institute for teachers in Prešov, a larger town to the south. Teaching attracted Maria for the same reason it attracted her mother. It was respectable work for a young woman in rural Slovakia. It provided a steady income, though not a large one. And it allowed her to stay connected to her community while making a difference in children's lives. She threw herself into her studies, excelling in her courses while also perfecting her language skills. By 1940, at just 18 years old, Maria had completed her training and begun her teaching career. Her first assignment was in Jarabina, not far from where she'd grown up. The work suited her. She was patient with her students, creative in her lessons, and genuinely cared about their progress. The village welcomed her. For a young woman from a modest background, it seemed like a good life was beginning to unfold. But darkness was spreading across Europe, and Slovakia was about to be swallowed by it. When Germany occupied Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Slovakia became a puppet state under Josef Tiso, a Catholic priest turned authoritarian leader. The new Slovak Republic aligned itself closely with Nazi Germany. German advisors swarmed into Bratislava. Slovak laws began mirroring German racial policies. Jews faced increasing persecution. Maria continued teaching, moving to a position in the small farming community of Hynova in central Slovakia. It was 1943, and the war was everywhere. Young men disappeared, conscripted to fight alongside German forces on the Eastern Front. Others vanished into labor camps. The people who remained lived with constant fear and uncertainty. Then, in early 1944, Maria's life changed forever. A Jewish family friend came to visit her at the school in Hynova. His name was Julius Goldberger, and he operated a lumber mill nearby. Because the Germans considered his lumber business useful, Julius had so far avoided deportation to a concentration camp. But he came to Maria desperate and terrified. He'd been hiding his sister and her 5-year-old son, but he'd come under suspicion. He needed to move them immediately. He asked Maria if she would hide them. Just for a few days, he promised. Just until he could find another place. Maria later recalled her reaction with characteristic honesty. She said she never intended to hide anyone, but her sister Marta came with Julius, and he was crying. And Maria admitted she was a softie, so she said yes to a few days of shelter. Those few days turned into months. From April through June 1944, Maria hid a Jewish woman and her young son in the Hynova schoolhouse where she taught. The woman and her child stayed in the RIA's living quarters. Maria herself slept in the classroom on the floor. Every morning she woke up wondering if this would be the day the Gestapo came. Every knock on the door made her heart race. Every unfamiliar face in the village could be an informant. The danger was very real. Slovak authorities worked hand in hand with German forces to identify and deport Jews. Anyone caught harboring Jews faced arrest, deportation, or execution. Maria knew this. She knew that her small act of kindness could get her killed, but looking at that terrified mother and frightened child, she couldn't turn them away. Inevitably, someone noticed. Someone always noticed in small villages where everyone knew everyone's business. Word reached the Slovak authorities that the young schoolteacher in Hynova was hiding Jews. A Slovak army captain was dispatched to question her. Maria prepared herself for arrest, but when the captain arrived and began his questioning, something unexpected happened. He was careful with his words, subtle in his approach, and then he made Maria an extraordinary offer. He revealed that he was part of the anti-fascist resistance movement. He would find a new hiding place for the woman and her son, but in exchange, Maria had to do something for him. She had to become a courier for the resistance. Maria later said she felt lucky, very lucky. If a different officer had come, one loyal to Tiso's regime, she wouldn't be alive to tell the story. But this captain gave her a choice that was really no choice at all. Face certain arrest and probable death, or work for the underground movement fighting against the Nazis. She chose to become a courier, and that decision set her on a path toward extraordinary danger and even more extraordinary heroism. Maria left her teaching position in Hynova and moved to Banská Bystrica, the main city of central Slovakia. This historic town, nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, had become the center of Slovak resistance activities. Maria took cover employment as a dressmaker, working for someone who sympathized with the underground movement. Her first mission came quickly. The resistance needed her to travel to a town 65 miles away to retrieve a suitcase. Maria didn't ask questions. He was terrified, but determined not to show it. And that mission was just a busy man who was hoping to seek his death by redeeming her. She took the train, picked up the suitcase, and began the journey back. Only years later, in 1989, did she learn what was inside that suitcase: a shortwave radio. If the Gestapo had caught her with it, she would have been tortured for information and then executed. On that first mission, Maria had several close calls. The train was stopped. Gestapo agents began systematically checking passengers' luggage. Maria's heart hammered in her chest as she watched them work their way down the compartment toward her. Then she noticed a group of Wehrmacht officers sitting nearby. One of them had been watching her. When he smiled at her, Maria smiled back. She started flirting with him, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm. The officers invited her to sit with them. One of them gallantly carried her suitcase into their compartment. When the Gestapo agents reached their compartment and saw Maria sitting with German officers, they simply saluted and moved on. The officer holding Maria's suitcase never suspected he was carrying resistance communications equipment. Maria kept her expression pleasant and her conversation light until the train reached Banska Bystrica. Only then, safe in her apartment, did she allow herself to shake with the fear she'd been suppressing for hours. That incident taught Maria something crucial about survival. Confidence and charm could be weapons as powerful as guns. Her perfect German language skills, her blue eyes, her quick wit, and her ability to think fast under pressure made her remarkably effective. The Nazis expected spies and resistance fighters to be nervous, furtive, and suspicious. Maria was none of those things. She was friendly, open, and seemingly naive. It was the perfect disguise. Because Maria spoke 5 languages fluently, Slovak, Russian, Hungarian, German, and some English, the resistance found her incredibly valuable. They assigned her to work as a translator, moving between different partisan groups who often couldn't communicate with each other. When the Slovak national uprising began at the end of August 1944, Maria was right in the center of it. The Slovak national uprising was an extraordinary moment in World War II history. It was one of the largest anti-Nazi insurrections in occupied Europe, comparable to the Warsaw Uprising. Parts of the Slovak army, disgusted with Tisau's collaboration with Hitler, turned against their own government. Partisan groups emerged from the mountains. The rebels quickly seized control of large portions of central and eastern Slovakia, including the WWII airfield near Banska Bystrica. The uprising created a temporary zone of liberation right in the heart of Nazi-controlled territory. For about 2 months, Slovak rebels held off German counterattacks. But everyone knew it couldn't last forever. The Germans had too many troops, too much equipment, too much experience. It was only a matter of time before they crushed the rebellion. In September 1944, American B-17 flying fortresses began landing at WWII airfield. These planes brought in teams from the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency that would later become the CIA. The missions were codenamed DAWES and Houseboat. Their objectives were to rescue downed Allied airmen who'd been shot down over Slovakia, gather intelligence on German positions, and provide support to the Slovak rebels. Leading the DAWES mission was Lieutenant Holt Green, a 35-year-old from South Carolina. Before the war, he'd been a cotton plantation owner. He was thin, just 6 feet tall but weighing barely 140 pounds, and hadn't met the physical standards for military service. But his intelligence and language abilities had made him valuable to the OSS. He'd already run successful missions in Yugoslavia earlier in 1944, helping recover downed pilots. Now he brought his team to Slovakia, wearing his Navy uniform, which confused the hell out of the American airmen who saw him step off the B-17. What was the Navy doing in landlocked Slovakia? Green's team included 12 OSS agents, weapons specialists, demolitions experts, and radio operators. There were also 18 American airmen who'd been shot down and rescued by the Slovak partisans. And trailing along with them, having talked his way onto one of the flights, was Joe Morton, a war correspondent for the Associated Press. Morton thought he was covering the story of his life. Maria met the Americans in Banska Bystrica. She'd been working as a translator for Soviet military intelligence during the uprising, helping translate documents from Slovak to Russian. The Soviets had sent military advisors to support the rebellion, though their help was far more limited than the Slovaks had hoped. When Maria met the American OSS officers, there was an immediate rapport. They desperately needed someone who could speak multiple languages and knew the local terrain. Maria was perfect for the job. But there was a complication. The Slovak national uprising was collapsing. By mid-October 1944, German forces had regrouped and launched a massive counteroffensive. 8 German divisions, numbering over 150,000 men, smashed into the rebel-held territories. The forces included elite Waffen-SS units, experienced Wehrmacht infantry, and ruthless anti-partisan specialists like the WWII Brigade, which had committed horrific atrocities during the Warsaw Uprising. The rebels fought bravely but couldn't hold. Town after town fell to the German advance. By late October, Banska Bystrica itself was under direct threat. The city that had been the heart of the uprising, where rebel government had established its headquarters, was about to fall. Tens of thousands of people began fleeing into the mountains: soldiers, partisans, civilians, and the American and British intelligence teams. Maria watched Banska Bystrica descend into chaos. She later described it as looking like a scene from Dante's Inferno. Buildings burned, artillery shells screamed overhead. Columns of refugees streamed out of the city, carrying whatever they could grab. German planes strafed the roads. The Soviets, who'd promised support, suddenly withdrew their advisors and stopped flying supply missions. The Americans and British found themselves abandoned behind German lines, with no way out. That's when Lieutenant Holt Green approached Maria. His team needed to escape Slovakia. They needed someone who knew the mountains, spoke the languages, could talk to villagers, and could think on her feet when things went wrong. Would she guide them? Would she risk her life to help Americans and British she'd only just met? Maria said yes. She'd been abandoned by the Soviets anyway. She had no loyalty to them. And these Americans seemed decent, desperate, and in need of help. So she joined the DAWES mission, becoming its guide, interpreter, scout, and eventually its savior. The group fled into the low Tatra Mountains. There were about 30 people total: the OSS agents, the British intelligence officers, the downed airmen, a few Slovak partisans, Joe Morton the reporter, and Maria. They moved mostly at night, hiding during the day. German patrols were everywhere, sweeping through villages, interrogating civilians, executing anyone suspected of helping the rebels. Maria's job was incredibly dangerous. While the men stayed hidden in the forest, she would walk down into villages. She'd approach houses carefully, watching for signs of German presence. Then she'd knock on doors and spin convincing cover stories. Sometimes she said she was looking for her brother. Sometimes she claimed her family had to evacuate from Banska Bystrica. She'd read people's reactions carefully. If they seemed sympathetic, she'd ask for food. If they seemed nervous or hostile, she'd thank them politely and disappear. She also gathered intelligence. While posing as an innocent peasant girl, she'd observe German troop movements, count vehicles, note where soldiers were billeted. Then she'd return to the group hidden in the mountains and report what she'd seen. This information helped the Americans and British plan their routes, avoiding areas with heavy German presence. But the real danger came from chance encounters on the roads. German soldiers patrolled constantly. Checkpoints appeared without warning. Maria's ability to speak perfect German saved the group again and again. When soldiers stopped her, she'd chat with them casually. She'd flirt a little if it helped. She'd ask innocent questions that the soldiers would answer, giving away information they shouldn't have shared. They saw a young Slovak woman in peasant clothes and never suspected she was an Allied intelligence asset. Years later, Maria recalled one particularly close call. She was stopped at a checkpoint where Wehrmacht officers were checking identification papers. One officer became suspicious of her travel documents. But another officer, charmed by Maria's smile and conversation, intervened on her behalf. They let her through. She walked away calmly, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The weather grew colder as October turned to November. The group was running out of food. Everyone was hungry, weak, and increasingly desperate. They knew the Germans had sent special SS anti-partisan units to track them specifically. The Edelweiss Mountain Division, experts in mountain warfare, were hunting for the American and British intelligence teams. The Germans knew the OSS was operating in Slovakia, and they were determined to capture or kill every agent means to be holding. Then came the blizzard on Mount Dumbier. Early November 1944 brought one of the worst storms in years to the low Tatra range. Wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour. The temperature plunged far below zero. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to a few feet. The group had no choice but to keep moving. Staying still meant freezing to death. Maria led them through conditions that seemed impossible to survive. The wind was so powerful, it literally knocked men off their feet. They'd be walking forward, leaning into the gale, and suddenly a gust would hit them broadside and send them tumbling into the snow. They had to help each other up repeatedly. Their fingers went numb inside their gloves. Their faces became covered with ice. Frostbite began creeping into their extremities. And everywhere around them were the frozen dead, bodies of partisan fighters who tried to cross the mountain and failed. Some had sat down to rest and never got up. Others had simply collapsed from exhaustion and cold. The bodies were frozen solid, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures. Maria and the others walked past them in silence, each person thinking the same thing. That could be us. That will be us if we stop moving. Maria's feet were already badly frostbitten by this point. Every step was agony. But she refused to stop. She refused to slow down. She kept encouraging the men, kept pointing out the route forward, kept them moving when all they wanted to do was lie down in the snow and rest. By the time they counted, they'd passed 83 frozen bodies on Mount Dumbier. 83 people who'd stopped during previous attempts to cross the mountain. The group finally reached a mining camp where partisan nurses were sheltering. These women dressed their frostbitten feet, gave them warm drinks, tried to restore some circulation to their frozen limbs. The Americans and British rested there briefly, but they couldn't stay long. The Germans were too close. Those same partisan nurses who showed such kindness were later murdered by the SS Edelweiss unit tracking the Dawes mission. From the mining camp, the group made their way to a hunting lodge high on the slopes of Mount Ďumbier. This was the lodge that had been chosen as a rendezvous point for the scattered elements of the OSS and British missions. Over the next few weeks, other intelligence officers and downed airmen made their way to this remote cabin. Joe Morton, the Associated Press reporter, reached the lodge and began gathering material for what he was convinced would be the greatest story of his life. By late December, the hunting lodge housed about 20 people. They were waiting for supplies to be airdropped. They were waiting for word from OSS headquarters in Italy about evacuation plans. They were waiting and hoping the Germans wouldn't find them. The lodge sat in isolation, surrounded by forest and mountains. It seemed safe. But everyone felt increasingly uneasy. Maria spent Christmas Eve 1944 at that hunting lodge. The Americans and British tried to maintain some holiday spirit despite their circumstances. They shared what little food they had. Someone might have sung carols quietly. But underneath the forced cheer was constant tension. They all knew the Edelweiss division was still out there, still searching. The group had planned to leave the lodge on Christmas Day, but they stayed an extra day, waiting for a supply drop that never came. That one-day delay saved Maria's life. On December 26th, Maria and 4 others, 2 American OSS officers and 2 British airmen, left the lodge to search for food and medical supplies in villages farther up the mountain. They expected to be gone for several hours. While they were away, the SS Edelweiss unit struck. Elite German troops surrounded the hunting lodge. They came at dawn when everyone inside was still sleeping or just waking up. The attack was swift and brutal. The Germans set the lodge on fire and captured everyone inside. 14 men were taken prisoner, including Lieutenant Holt Green, the DAWES mission commander. Joe Morton, the reporter who thought he was covering the greatest story of his life, was among those captured. The prisoners were bound, loaded onto trucks, and transported to Germany. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, personally ordered that they be sent to Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Mauthausen was one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system, classified as Category 3, for prisoners considered to have no chance of rehabilitation. It was essentially a death camp, disguised as a labor camp. The OSS and British intelligence officers were kept in isolation at Mauthausen. In early January 1945, German intelligence officers arrived to interrogate them. Werner Müller, one of Berlin's top linguists, and Dr. Hans Wilhelm Thost conducted the interrogations. Camp Commandant Franz Zierreis personally participated, and according to post-war testimony, he took sadistic pleasure in torturing the prisoners. The Americans and British tried to maintain their dignity. They gave only name, rank, and serial number, as required by the Geneva Convention. They hoped their status as military officers would protect them. But Hitler's commando order, issued in 1942, specifically stated that Allied special forces and intelligence operatives were to be executed immediately upon capture, regardless of whether they were in uniform. On January 24, 1945, the prisoners were told they were being taken to the camp bathhouse. They undressed, still believing this was a routine procedure. Then they were photographed. An SS officer named George Bachmeier systematically shot each man in the back of the head. Holt Green, James Gall, Nelson Paris, Joe Horvath, Joe Morton, and the others were executed one by one. Their bodies were immediately cremated. Back in Slovakia, Maria and the 4 men who'd left the lodge with her had no idea what had happened. When they returned to where the lodge had been, they found only charred ruins and signs of a violent struggle. They realized immediately that the others had been captured or killed. They were now on their own, hunted by the same SS unit that had just destroyed their base camp. The 5 survivors had to disappear completely. They couldn't risk approaching villages anymore. The Germans were executing entire communities suspected of harboring Allied personnel. SS units were sweeping through the region systematically, using dogs to track fugitives. The 5 of them, Maria, 2 American enlisted men named Catlos and Dunleavy, 1 British officer and 1 British enlisted man, began 9 weeks of constant flight. They moved almost every single night. They'd find a barn and sleep there for a few hours, then move before dawn. They'd hide in abandoned mining shafts during the day. They'd go days without food. They suffered from lice infestations that made them constantly itchy and miserable. The frostbite in Maria's feet worsened. Her toes had turned black. She could barely walk, but she refused to seek medical attention. She knew what would happen if she went to a hospital. The Germans had her name by now. They'd been interrogating villagers, learning who had helped the Americans. If Maria showed up at any hospital or clinic, she'd be arrested immediately. She told the others her reasoning with stark clarity. Better to die on her feet than in a concentration camp. Better to keep moving, even if her frostbitten feet eventually cost her the ability to walk, than to be captured and tortured. So she kept going, step after painful step, through January, February, and into early March 1945. The small group made their way slowly eastward, trying to reach Soviet lines, but the Eastern Front was still far away, and the territory they had to cross was crawling with German troops. They traveled mostly at night, through forests and along mountain ridges where they were less likely to encounter patrols. During the day, they'd hide and try to rest. Fear was their constant companion. They never felt safe, not even for a moment. Despite the danger, Maria continued to use her language skills and intelligence-gathering abilities. When they absolutely had to pass through populated areas, she'd scout ahead. Her perfect German and innocent appearance still worked as camouflage. German soldiers saw a young Slovak woman traveling alone and didn't give her a second look. She'd listen to their conversations, pick up information about troop movements, then report back to guide the group around German positions. The four men with Maria were in awe of her. They'd later describe her as incredibly brave, resourceful, and determined. Sergeant Ken Dunleavy, one of the American enlisted men, said she was our little sweetheart, for whom I am and will be grateful forever. He added that he owed his safety and probably his life to Maria's courage and quick thinking. As the weeks dragged on, their physical condition deteriorated badly. They were all suffering from malnutrition, frostbite, and exhaustion. Maria's frostbitten feet were getting worse. The British officer developed a serious illness. But they kept moving because stopping meant certain capture and execution. They could hear the war changing around them. Soviet artillery fire grew louder as the Red Army pushed westward. But the front lines were still frustratingly far away. Finally, in early March 1945, after 9 weeks on the run, they made contact with Soviet forces. They'd crossed into Romania, reaching the area around Bucharest. Maria later described the overwhelming relief of finally being safe. For more than 4 months, since the German counteroffensive began in late October, she'd been living with constant fear. Now, suddenly, it was over. She'd survived. The Soviets passed Maria and her companions to American OSS headquarters in Italy. Maria was immediately put on military payroll status so she could be compensated for her service. OSS officers who debriefed her were astounded by what she'd accomplished. This 23-year-old schoolteacher had saved American and British lives through months of incredibly dangerous work. She'd guided intelligence officers through enemy territory, gathered crucial information, and kept them alive when most people would have crumbled under the pressure. From Italy, Maria was assigned to Prague as an interpreter. The war in Europe was entering its final months. American and Soviet forces were closing in on Germany from both sides. In Prague, Maria met Alan Dulles, a senior OSS officer who would later become the director of the CIA. Dulles was immediately impressed by Maria's story. He made a point of mentioning her to General William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS. Donovan and Dulles arranged for Maria to immigrate to the United States after the war ended. They set her up with a scholarship to Vassar College in New York so she could study economics. When she arrived at Vassar in late 1945, Maria felt completely out of place. The campus seemed impossibly wealthy and wasteful to someone who'd spent years watching people starve. On her first night in the dining hall, she broke down crying when she saw students throwing away food. She thought of the millions of hungry, starving people across Europe, including her own family. The casual waste was physically painful to witness. But the most important moment came in May 1946. General Donovan personally arranged for a special ceremony at the United States Military Academy at West Point. On the parade ground known as the Plain, in front of the entire Corps of Cadets, Maria Gulovich was prepared to see the Bronze Star. A citation read, "Heroic and meritorious service. In aiding American and British intelligence personnel escape Nazi-occupied territory during the winter of 1944 to 1945. Maria became the first woman ever to receive a military decoration at West Point, with the full Corps of Cadets assembled. She stood on that historic parade ground, wearing a simple dress, still thin from her ordeal, her feet permanently damaged by frostbite. Around her, thousands of cadets in their grey uniforms stood at attention. General Donovan pinned the Bronze Star to her dress and shook her hand. The cadets applauded. It was an extraordinary moment of recognition for an extraordinary woman. The Los Angeles Times ran an article about Maria in September 1946. The reporter described her as Vivacious Maria Gulovich, 25, Czechoslovakian schoolteacher who arrived here yesterday, is the essence of what fictionalized women spies should look like. It was typical of how people reacted to Maria. She didn't fit their expectations of what a war hero should be. She was young, pretty, and friendly. She smiled easily. She didn't act like someone who'd done anything remarkable. But the men who'd been with her in Slovakia knew different. They knew she'd saved their lives repeatedly through courage, intelligence, and sheer determination. Maria completed her studies at Vasa, though she never felt entirely comfortable there. After graduation, she moved to Oxnard, California, where she built a new life far from the frozen mountains of Slovakia. She married Eugene C. Peck, an attorney, and they had 2 children together, Edmund and Lynn. The marriage eventually ended, and Maria later married Hans P. Liu. She established a successful career as a real estate agent in Ventura County, earning a reputation for honesty and competence. For decades, Maria's wartime service remained largely unknown outside intelligence circles. The OSS kept most of its wartime operations classified for many years after the war ended. The tragic fate of the DAWES mission, with most of its members executed at Mauthausen, was one of the OSS's most painful failures of World War II. The agency didn't publicize it. Maria herself rarely talked about her experiences. She'd lost touch with most of the people she'd known during the war. The memories were painful, and she'd built a new life that had nothing to do with espionage or danger. It wasn't until 1989 that the OSS finally honored the women who'd served the agency during World War II. Maria was invited to a black-tie dinner in Washington, D.C., called the Ladies of the OSS. There she reconnected with other women who'd done extraordinary things during the war: codebreakers, analysts, field operatives, resistance fighters. For the first time in decades, she could talk to people who understood what that kind of service had cost. In that same year, 1989, Maria gave several interviews to researchers and historians who were documenting OSS operations in Slovakia. She described the blizzard on Mount Dumbier, the frozen bodies they'd passed, her frostbitten feet, and the constant fear of capture. She talked about how she'd learned to charm German soldiers, how she'd used her language skills as a survival tool, and how close she'd come to death so many times. Historians began to recognize the significance of her story. Jim Downs published his book, World War II, OSS Tragedy in Slovakia, in 2002, which detailed the DAWES mission and Maria's role in it. Later, Sonia M. Jason published Maria Gulovich, OSS Heroine of World War II. In 2008, a full biography focusing on Maria's wartime experiences. These books finally brought Maria's story to a wider audience. People who read them were astounded. How had this remarkable woman remained virtually unknown for so long? Maria lived out her remaining years in California, surrounded by her family. She had her children, her sisters who'd also immigrated to America, and a granddaughter named Elizabeth Maria Peck. She never fully escaped the physical effects of her wartime experiences. Her feet, damaged by frostbite on Mount Dumbier, gave her trouble for the rest of her life. But she'd survived when so many others hadn't. That was what mattered. Maria Gulovich Liu died on September 25, 2009, at the age of 87. The cause was colon cancer. She passed away at her home in Port Hueneme, California, with her family nearby. Her obituary noted her wartime service and Bronze Star, but for most people reading it, this was the first they'd heard of her. Even at her death, Maria remained largely unknown to the general public. But among military historians, intelligence professionals, and those who study the role of women in World War II, Maria Gulovich's story shines like a beacon. She represents something profound about courage under pressure. She wasn't a trained soldier. She wasn't a professional spy. She was a 23-year-old elementary school teacher who spoke several languages and had a gift for reading people and situations. When Maria was asked to hide a Jewish woman and her child, she said yes, even though it put her life at risk. When the resistance needed a courier, she said yes, even though she was terrified. When the Americans needed a guide through enemy territory, she said yes, even though she could have walked away. At every crucial moment, when she could have chosen safety over danger, Maria chose to help others. That's the essence of heroism. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. The frozen corpses on Mount Dumbier haunt her story. 83 people who stopped to rest. 83 people who couldn't take one more step. Maria passed every single one of them, her own feet blackened with frostbite, her body weakened by hunger and exhaustion. She could have stopped. Everyone would have understood. But she didn't stop. She kept moving because 12 American intelligence officers and 18 downed airmen were counting on her. She kept moving because stopping meant death for all of them. Think about that for a moment. A 23-year-old schoolteacher from a small village in Slovakia, leading hardened military men through a catastrophic blizzard on Slovakia's highest mountain. Speaking 5 languages to extract information from enemy soldiers. Charming her way past Gestapo checkpoints with a suitcase full of illegal radio equipment. Spending 9 weeks sleeping in barns and mines infested with lice, feet destroyed by frostbite, refusing medical treatment because she knew it meant capture and torture. Maria's Bronze Star citation called her service heroic and meritorious. Those formal military words barely scratched the surface of what she accomplished. She saved lives through intelligence, courage, and stubborn determination. She proved that heroism doesn't require physical strength or military training. Sometimes it just requires a person willing to keep walking when everyone else wants to stop. A person willing to smile at the enemy and lie convincingly. A person willing to risk everything for strangers because it's the right thing to do. The tragedy is that Maria's story remained unknown for so long. While male OSS officers and military heroes received recognition and glory, this remarkable woman lived in quiet obscurity in California, selling houses and raising her children. It took more than 40 years after the war ended for the OSS to even formally acknowledge the contributions of women like Maria. And it took more than 60 years for her story to be told in any detail to the general public. But now we know. Now we can tell Maria's story to a new generation. We can honor her memory by remembering what she did. We can learn from her example. And we can ask ourselves if we would have had the same courage, the same determination, the same willingness to sacrifice ourselves for others. Most of us will never face a test like Maria faced on Mount Dumbier. But her story reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. Maria Gulovich, the schoolteacher from Yakubani, who became a Bronze Star recipient. Maria Gulovich, who led men through a blizzard past 83 frozen corpses. Maria Gulovich, who charmed Gestapo agents and German officers while carrying out espionage work. Maria Gulovich, who spent 9 weeks on the run with frostbitten feet, refusing to give up. Maria Gulovich, who stood on the plain at West Point and received a medal in front of thousands of cadets. Maria Gulovich, who lived a long, quiet life in California and died largely unknown. Her story deserves to be remembered, not just as a footnote in OSS history, not just as an interesting World War II anecdote, but as an example of courage in its purest form. The courage to help when helping is dangerous. The courage to keep going when stopping would be easier. The courage to do what's right, even when no one will ever know what you did. That's the legacy of Maria Gulovich, and that's why her story matters.